poor black old woman was sentenced to death for taking in homeless twins. 27 years later, the impossible happened. Your Honors, 27 years ago, they sentenced a black woman to death for feeding hungry children. David Mitchell's voice thundered through the Supreme Court chamber, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the frail figure in the wheelchair. Today we stand before you as those children, and we're here to prove that the greatest crime in American history wasn't what she did to save us, but what the system did to destroy her for loving us unconditionally. Before we get deep into today's story, I really want to know where you are watching from across the world. Please, drop in the comments section where you're watching. Hit the subscribe button if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have created something very special just for you, another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Once again, welcome to Mr. Paul's Stories, where we come together like old friends, wrapped in the warmth of stories that light up our souls. Now, let's begin today's story. Detroit, Michigan, November 1997. The radiator in apartment 4B hadn't worked since Clinton's first term, but Rose Washington's hands stayed warm from the constant motion, stirring oatmeal, braiding hair, wiping tears, holding hearts. At 68, her fingers moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had mothered half of Detroit's forgotten children, though she'd never birthed one of her own. "Mama Rose, Kevin won't share the blanket," 7-year-old Jasmine whispered, tugging at Rose's worn house dress. The fabric, once a vibrant blue, had faded to the color of Detroit winter skies, gray with hints of hope. "Honey, there's enough warmth for everybody when we huddle together," Rose murmured, her voice carrying the deep musical cadence that had lullabied countless children to sleep. She adjusted the threadbare quilt that covered Kevin and Marcus. No, she caught herself, Kevin and Timothy on the couch that doubled as their bed. The apartment on Corktown's Bagley Street wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where the linoleum curled at the edges, a living room that hosted anywhere from 3 to 8 children depending on how cold the streets got. But Rose had painted the walls sunshine yellow with her own hands, hung discount store curtains that she'd sewn with care, and filled every corner with a kind of love that made broken children believe in tomorrow again. Through the frost-etched window, she could see the abandoned Packard plant looming like a metallic skeleton against the November sky. Detroit was bleeding jobs, bleeding hope, bleeding families. But not here. Not in Rose Washington's home. Mrs. Rose. A small voice came from the kitchen doorway. Angela, barely 5, held a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. "I'm scared." Rose's heart clenched. Angela had been with her for 2 weeks now, dropped off by a social worker who spoke in tired bureaucratic sentences about temporary placement and system overload. But Rose knew the language of abandoned children. Angela's scared wasn't about monsters under beds. It was about adults who disappeared, about promises that shattered, about learning too young that love had expiration dates. "Come here, baby girl." Rose opened her arms, and Angela melted into them like snow meeting warm earth. "What's got you frightened? What if my mama doesn't come back? What if nobody wants me?" Rose tilted Angela's chin up, looking into eyes that held too much knowledge for 5 years. "Listen to me, sweet pea. Wanting you isn't something anybody has to learn how to do. You're wantable just by breathing. And Mama Rose? She's not going anywhere. What do you think makes someone like Mama Rose dedicate her life to caring for children who aren't biologically hers? Share your thoughts below. 3 blocks away, in the shadow of the Renaissance Center's gleaming towers, 2 small figures pressed against a chain-link fence, watching steam rise from McDonald's dumpster. David and Davidson Mitchell, 8-year-old twins with matching hollowed cheeks and eyes that had seen too much, hadn't eaten in 36 hours. Davidson's stomach cramped again. He pressed his hand against it, trying to make the emptiness stop screaming. "Maybe we should go back to the Helter," he whispered to his brother. David shook his head fiercely. His protective instincts had sharpened during their 3 months on Detroit streets. "You remember what happened last time? That man with the hands." Davidson nodded, shuddering. They'd learned that hunger was safer than some kinds of help. "I heard some kids talking about a lady," Davidson said, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "They said she feeds anybody who comes to her door. On Bagley Street." David studied his brother's face. Davidson had always been the dreamer between them, the one who still believed in fairy tales despite everything they'd endured since their grandmother has died and left them with no one. But David had also seen Davidson's dreams come true in small ways, like the time he'd wide for dry socks and found a pair in a donation box, or when he dreamed of hot soup and a church had opened its doors during a blizzard. "What's his name?" he asked. "Mama Rose." The name hung between them like a prayer. David made the decision that would change everything. "Okay, we'll try." They walked through Detroit's downtown, past the Fox Theater. Wise families in warm coats waited in lines they could never afford to join, past the Detroit River. Wise ice formed at the edges like nature's own fence. Their shoes, too big, donated from Somewise, held together with duct tape, squeaked against the sidewalk with each step. When they finally found Bagley Street, Davidson pointed to apartment 4B. Golden light spilled from the windows, and they could hear something impossible: laughter. Children's laughter, mixed with a woman's voice singing something low and sweet. "Maybe we shouldn't," David said, suddenly afraid. What if this was Anno, this adult who would look at them and see burden instead of children? What if kindness was just Anno, this word they'd have to learn didn't apply to them? But Davidson was already walking toward the door, his hand raised to knock. Rose was reading Wise the Wild Things Are to Angela and Timothy when he heard the soft tapping. Not the demanding pound of social services or the aggressive bang of bill collectors, but the hesitant tap of children who'd learned to ask permission for existing. He opened the door and saw them, two small figures backlit by the hallway's fluorescent light, holding hands like they were the only solid things in each Othus's universe. The boy stood slightly in front of the boy, his chin raised in defiance even as his body trembled from cold. The boy's eyes held a desperate hope that made Rose's chest tighten. "We heard." The boy started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "We heard you help kids." Rose took in their appearance in one practiced glance: clothes that had been slept in for weeks, shoes that let in Detroit's winter, hair that needed washing and arms that needed holding. But more than that, he saw their spirits, cracked but not broken, afraid but still brave enough to knock on a stranger's door. "What are your names, babies?" "I'm Davidson. This is David. We're twins." "How long since you've eaten?" David's jaw tightened. He'd learned that admitting need was dangerous. "We're fine." But Davidson's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying them both. Rose stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Well, I just made way too much soup for the kids. I've got heiss. Hate to see good food go to waste." Davidson looked at David, pleading with his eyes. David looked at Rose, searching his face for the lies that adults often hid behind kindness. But Rose Washington's face was an open book written in a language he'd almost forgotten: genuine care. "Just for tonight?" he asked, his 8-year-old voice trying to sound grown. "Just for as long as you need," Rose replied. And with those words, he sealed all their fates. Detroit, Michigan, December 1997. The knock came at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would split Rose Washington's life into before and after. Not the gentle tap of hungry children or the familiar rhythm of neighbors needing help. This knock carried the weight of authority, sharp, demanding, final. Rose's eyes opened in the pre-dawn darkness, his body already knowing that everything was about to change. David stirred on the air mattress beside Davidson, both twins having claimed the spot closest to Rose's bedroom door. In the month since they'd arrived, they'd never quite believed they were safe enough to sleep far from his voice. Even in slumber, David's hand rested protectively on his brother's shoulder. Detroit police. Open up. Rose's feet found the cold floor, his movements deliberate despite the fear crawling up his spine. He wrapped his robe around his thin frame and moved toward the living room while Angela, Timothy, and Kevin were beginning to wake, their young faces confused and frightened. "It's okay, babies," he whispered, though his voice carried a tremor he couldn't hide. "Just stay calm." When he opened the door, 6 officers filled his narrow hallway like a storm cloud. Detective Mike Sullivan, a man whose face had been carved from disappointment and prejudice, stepped forward with a badge that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light. "Rose Washington?" "Yes, sir." His grandmother's training kicked in. Always be respectful to white authority, even when it came to destroy you. You're under arrest for child endangerment, contributing to the delinquency of minors, and operating an unlicensed foster facility. The words hit his like physical blows. Behind Sullivan, he could see Mrs. Henderson from 4C peering through his cracked door, satisfaction written across his pinched features. Rose had always known some neighbors resented the parade of broken children who found their way to his apartment, but he'd never imagined. "I don't understand," Rose said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "These children have no wise else. Save it for the judge." Sullivan's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who decided his guilt long before arriving at his door. "We've got reports of overcrowding, inadequate supervision, and unsanitary conditions." Rose's eyes swept his small apartment, the carefully arranged sleeping areas, the kitchen he scrubbed twice daily, the children's artwork covering every available wall space like colorful prayers. Unsanitary? His home was cleaner than most apartments twice its size. "Mama Rose." Davidson's voice, small and terrified, came from behind his. The twins had crept to the doorway, their faces pale with the kind of fear that came from watching adults you trusted get taken away. "It's going to be okay, sweet pea," Rose said, though the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Officer Janet Morrison, the only woman among the 6, stepped forward with handcuffs. His face held a flicker of something that might have been regret. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around." The metal was cold against Rose's wrists, but not as cold as the realization washing over his. This wasn't about overcrowding or supervision. This was about a black woman in a poor neighborhood loving children that the system had thrown away. This was about crossing invisible lines that powerful people had drawn around who deserved saving. "What about the children?" Rose asked, his voice breaking as the cuffs clicked into place. "Social services is on the way," Sullivan replied with the tone of a man checking items off a grocery list. "No." Davidson's cry pierced the morning air. "Please don't take Mama Rose. Please." David grabbed his brother, pulling his back as he reached toward Rose. His 8-year-old face had aged years in the span of minutes, the hope that had slowly begun to bloom in his eyes withering like flowers in winter. "Listen to me," Rose called out as the officers began to guide his toward the door. "All of you, listen to me good. This isn't the end of our story, you hear me? Love doesn't die just because they put it in chains. Have you ever witnessed someone being punnyhead for doing the right thing? What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments." The Wayne County Jail had swallowed thousands of Detroit's forgotten, but it had never held anyone quite like Rose Washington. As the metal door clanged shut behind his, he found himself in a holding cell with 3 Othis women, 2 prostitutes named Cookie and Raquel, and a young woman with track marks on his arms who wouldn't give his name. "What you in for, Grandma?" Cookie asked, his voice carrying the hard edge of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from everyone. "Loving children," Rose replied simply. The unnamed woman laughed bitterly. They got creative names for everything these days. No, Rose said, sitting on the narrow bench with his hands folded in his lap like he was in church instead of jail. I mean, I loved children who had nowise else to go. Fed them, held them, gave them beds to sleep in. Apparently, that's a crime now. Cookie and Raquel exchanged glances. In their world, people lied as naturally as breathing. But something in Rose's voice, something in the way he held himself with dignity even in an orange jumpsuit, made them pause. You for real? Raquel asked softly. For real? The preliminary hearing was a masterclass in judicial theater. Judge Harold Brennan, a man whose grandfathers had probably owned people who looked like Rose, presided over the proceedings with a gavel of absolute authority. His courtroom was a monument to white marble justice, but the justice being served was anything but blind. District Attorney Patricia Calloway stood before the bench like an avenging angel in a $1,500 suit. His blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched his severe interpretation of the law. Your Honor, the defendant has been operating what can only be described as a child trafficking operation under the guise of charitable work. Our investigation reveals that Mrs. Washington has housed upwards of 12 children at a time in a 2-bedroom apartment, with no proper licensing, no background checks, and no oversight whatsoever. Rose's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man named Gerald Fisses who'd clearly drawn the short straw, shuffled through papers with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. The state requests remand without bail, Calloway continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. Mrs. Washington represents a clear and present danger to the welfare of children throughout this community. Judge Brennan's eyes found Rose in the defendant's chair. He sat straight-backed, his hands folded, his face serene despite the storm raging around his. When their eyes met, he didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he saw him, really saw him, and something in his gaze made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. Mrs. Washington, Brennan said, his voice echoing in the marble chamber. How do you plead to these charges? Rose stood slowly, his movements carrying the grace of a woman who knew his worth regardless of his circumstances. Not guilty, Your Honor. Not guilty of anything except trying to make sure babies don't freeze to death on Detroit streets. A murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery, wise a handful of community members had gathest. Mrs. Patterson from the church, old Mr. Jeffries from the corner store, Sarah Chen who ran the Chinese restaurant, people who had seen Rose's work firsthand. Your Honor, Gerald Fisses said, clearing his throat nervously, my client has no prior criminal record and deep community ties. He poses no flight risk. Mr. Fisses, Judge Brennan interrupted, your client stands accused of endangering the lives of multiple children. The court cannot ignore the severity of these charges. But it was D.A. Calloway who delivered the killing blow. Your Honor, given the egregious nature of these crimes and their impact on innocent children, the state is prepared to seek the ultimate penalty. We will be pursuing the death sentence under Michigan's child endangerment statutes. The courtroom erupted. Even hardened court reporters looked up from their machines in shock. The death penalty for taking in homeless children? Rose felt the words hit his like a physical blow, but he didn't stumble. Instead, he thought of David and Davidson, probably sitting in some sterile social services office, wondering if the one person who had ever truly loved them was gone forever. So be it, he whispered, the words lost in the chaos of the courtroom. Judge Brennan's gavel came down like thunder. The defendant will be held without bail pending trial. Court adjourned. As the bailiff approached with shackles, Rose looked back at the gallery one last time. Through the tall windows, he could see the Detroit River flowing past the Renaissance Center, carrying water toward Lake Erie and beyond. Water that had no boundaries, no walls, no chains. Love was like that water, he told himself as the metal closed around his ankles. It would find a way to flow, no matter what they built to stop it. Even if it took 27 years. The last thing he heard as they led his away was Mrs. Patterson's voice from the gallery, strong and clear despite his tears. "We'll be praying for you, Rose. We'll be praying every single day." In a foster home across town, David Mitchell pressed his face against a window and watched the same river flow past, wondering if prayers could travel on water, and if somewise in the world, Mama Rose could feel them coming. The impossible had begun. Detroit, Michigan, January 1998. The Wayne County Courthouse stood like a monument to justice on Cadillac Square, its limestone facade promising equality under law. But justice, Rose Washington was learning, wore different faces depending on who was standing in its shadow. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harold Morrison. Rose's shackled hands trembled as he stood between his court-appointed attorneys, two young men who looked like they'd rotties be anywise else, shuffling papers with the enthusiasm of pallbearers. Behind he could hear the whispered prayers of his church family, their voices a familiar hymn in an unfamiliar hell. Judge Morrison, a stern white man in his 60s whose reputation for harsh sentences preceded him like a storm cloud, surveyed the packed courtroom. His eyes lingered on Rose for a moment, this elderly black woman who had somehow become the center of a media circus. "The People versus Rose Washington," the clerk announced. "Charges of reckless endangerment of minors, operating an unlicensed child care facility, and—" He paused, the words hanging heavy in the air, "felony child abuse resulting in substantial risk of death." The last charge hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Someone in the gallery gasped. Rose's knees nearly buckled. His lawyer, David Chun, barely 26 and handling his third criminal case, leaned over. "Mrs. Washington, we need to discuss a plea bargain. The prosecutor is asking for—" "No." Rose's voice was quiet but firm. "I won't plead guilty to hurting children. I'd rotties die first." Those words would prove prophetic. District Attorney Patricia Kellerman stood to address the court, his red suit as sharp as his ambition. At 42, he was positioning himself for a run at State Attorney General, and this case, with its perfect storm of media attention and moral outrage, was his launching pad. "Your Honor, the defendant stands accused of operating what can only be described as a house of horrors. Under the guise of charity, Rose Washington collected children like some people collect stray cats, cramming them into unsafe, unsanitary conditions with no regard for their well-being." Rose closed his eyes, hearing his own life twisted into something unrecognizable. The state will prove that Mrs. Washington's so-called rescue of the Mitchell twins was actually an act of criminal negligence. These children were found malnourished, inadequately clothed, and living in conditions that violated every health and safety code in the city of Detroit. The prosecutor clicked to his first slide, a photograph of Rose's apartment taken the morning of the arrest. The camera had captured everything at its worst angle: the peeling wallpaper, the overcrowded furniture, the industrial-sized boxes of generic cereal that made the place look like a warehouse rather than a home. This is why 8 children were forced to live, sleeping 3 and 4 to a bed, sharing meals that barely met subsistence levels. What the photograph didn't capture was Timothy's laughter when he'd helped Rose make pancakes that Sunday morning. It didn't show Angela's artwork taped proudly to the refrigerator, or the way Davidson had slept peacefully for the first time in months, curled up next to David on Rose's own bed because nightmares came less frequently when they were close to someone who made them feel safe. "Furthermore," Kellerman continued, his voice rising with practiced indignation, "the Mitchell twins were found to be suffering from malnutrition, exposure, and psychological trauma, all of which occurred under Mrs. Washington's care." Rose's attorney finally found his voice. "Objection, Your Honor. The children were already malnourished when they came to Mrs. Washington. He was nursing them back to health." Overruled. Ms. Kellerman, continue. David Chun sank back into his chair like a deflated balloon. Rose realized with growing dread that his fate was being decided by people who had never gone to bed hungry, never opened their doors to children who had nowise else to go. Have you ever witnessed injustice in the legal system? What do you think drives prosecutors to sometimes prioritize their careers over truth? Let us know in the comments. In the gallery, Reverend Marcus Thompson from New Hope Baptist Church watched the proceedings with growing fury. He had known Rose Washington for 30 years, had watched his transform dozens of young lives. The woman being described in this courtroom was a stranger. "This is not justice," he whispered to his wife, Dolores, who sat beside him clutching a tissue. "This is a lynching in a suit and tie." 3 rows behind them, social worker Janet Peters shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was the one who had made the call that started this avalanche. He'd been doing his job, following up on reports of overcrowded living conditions. But when he'd arrived at Rose's apartment and seen the situation through the cold lens of regulations and bureaucracy, he'd failed to see what the children themselves knew. This was the first place they'd ever felt safe. Now, watching Rose's dignity under attack, Janet felt the weight of his decision crushing his chest like a stone. The prosecutor continued his systematic demolition. "The state will also show that Mrs. Washington accepted these children without proper background checks, without approval from Child Protective Services, and without any of the safeguards designed to protect vulnerable minors. He protected us when nobody else would," a voice called from the gallery. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like a whip. "I will have order in this courtroom. Honor this outburst, and I'll clear the gallery." The voice had belonged to Marcus, not the Marcus from Rose's apartment, but Marcus Williams, now 19, whom Rose had taken in 7 years earlier when his Mothus died of an overdose. He was working 2 jobs, putting himself through community college, and planning to become a teacher. None of that mattered to the legal system dissecting the woman who had saved his life. Rose's lawyer attempted a response. "Your Honor, my client's actions, while perhaps not following strict bureaucratic protocols, were motivated entirely by compassion. He saw children in need and—" "Mr. Chun," Judge Morrison interrupted, "the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The law exists to protect children, not to accommodate individual acts of charity, however well-meaning." The irony was suffocating. A law designed to protect children was being used to destroy the one person who had actually protected them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, no relation to the twins, took the witness stand. A pediatrician with an impressive resume and a cold demeanor, he had examined David and Davidson during their intake at the Children's Hospital. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, what was the condition of the Mitchell children when they were removed from the defendant's care?" Both children showed signs of chronic malnutrition, poor dental hygiene, and psychological distress. Their weight was significantly below normal ranges for their age. And in your expert opinion, was this neglect the result of their time with Mrs. Washington? David Chun shot to his feet. "Objection. The doctor has no knowledge of the children's condition before they lived with my client." Sustained. Ms. Kellerman, rephrase. But the damage was done. The jury, 11 white faces and 1 black woman who looked like he was trying to disappear into his seat, had heard what they needed to hear. In their minds, Rose Washington was transforming from grandmother's figure to child abuser. The prosecutor's cross-examination was surgical in its cruelty. "Dr. Mitchell, is it possible that proper nutrition and medical care could have prevented the conditions you observed?" "Yes, absolutely." "And would a licensed child care facility be required to provide such care?" "Yes." What went unsaid was that David and Davidson had been starving on the streets for months before Rose found them. What went unsaid was that in the 6 weeks they'd lived with they had gained weight, started smiling again, and begun to trust that adults could be safe. What went unsaid was that the system demanding their protection had offered them nothing but the dangers they'd fled from in the first place. Rose's attorney made a valiant attempt at redirect. "Dr. Mitchell, do you know why these children were living before they came to Mrs. Washington?" "I was told they were homeless." "And in your medical opinion, is homelessness harmful to children's health?" "Of course. More harmful than living in a warm home with regular meals and adult supervision." Dr. Mitchell hesitated. For a moment, his clinical mask slipped, and something human flickered behind his eyes. That would depend on the specific circumstances." It was a small victory in a war that was already lost. The afternoon brought character witnesses, teachers who testified about the transformation they'd seen in Rose's children, neighbors who spoke of his generosity, church members who described his as a living saint. But their words seemed to bounce off the courtroom walls like rain off stone. The system had made its decision. Rose Washington represented everything they feared: uncontrolled compassion, help offered outside official channels, love that didn't wait for paperwork. When court adjourned for the day, Rose was led back to his cell in Wayne County Jail. His cellmate, Maria Santos, looked up from the letter he was writing to his own children. "How did it go, Mija?" Rose sat heavily on the thin mattress, feeling every one of his 68 years. "They're making me sound like a monster, Maria. These people who've never missed a meal in their lives are judging me for the crime of feeding hungry children." Maria reached over and took Rose's hand. At 26, he'd been arrested for shoplifting baby formula. This crime of love in a world that criminalized desperation. "The truth has a way of coming out, Rose. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but truth is patient." Rose squeezed his hand gratefully, but in his heart, he wondered if he would live long enough to see it. Outside the courthouse, David and Davidson Mitchell sat in the back of a social services van, watching the building while the woman who had saved them was being destroyed. They pressed their small hands against the window, and in that moment, something crystallized in their 8-year-old hearts. Someday, they would learn to fight back. Someday, they would have the power to protect the protector. Someday, they would make sure that love like Rose Washington's was never criminalized again. But first, they had to survive long enough to grow up. As the van pulled away, carrying them toward any of this uncertain placement, Davidson whispered to his brother, "We're going to save his, David. Someday, we're going to save Mama Rose." David nodded, his jaw set with determination that seemed too old for his face. "Promise. Promise." It was a vow that would take 27 years to fulfill. Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility, Ypsilanti, Michigan, December 1997. The steel door slammed behind Rose Washington with a finality that echoed through his bones. Cell Block D wasn't wise. They usually put death row inmates, but overcrowding had shuffled the deck, and Rose found himself in general population, a 68-year-old woman surrounded by hardened criminals who'd heard whispers about the baby killer from Detroit. His cellmate, Denise Tank Rodriguez, looked like he could bench press a Buick. Arms covered in tattoos that told stories of streets Rose had only driven through, Tank sat on the bottom bunk, sizing up this elderly black woman who'd somehow earned a death sentence. "So you're the monster who murdered them kids," Tank said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Funny. You don't look like no monster." Rose set his few belongings, a Bible, one photograph of David and Davidson, and a worn copy of Goodnight Moon on the small metal shelf. His hands didn't shake, though everything inside his was trembling. "I didn't murder anybody, child. I loved them." Tank laughed, but theirs was no humor in it. "That's what they all say. My son's foster mom said he loved his too, right before he..." Tank's voice caught, and he turned away sharply. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Rose had learned, in his decades of caring for broken children, that anger was often just grief wearing a disguise. "How old is your son?" Rose asked softly. How old was my son? Tank's voice cracked like breaking glass. 7. Would have been 15 now if I hadn't been so strung out that they took us away from me. He turned back to Rose, eyes blazing. "So don't talk to me about loving kids, old woman. Some of us actually lost ours." Rose sat on his thin mattress, feeling the weight of every child he'd held, every tear he'd dried, every nightmare he chased away. What was his name? Isabella. But I called his Izzy. Tank's voice dropped to a whisper. He had these little dimples when he smiled. Used to wake me up singing Disney songs, even when we didn't have no food in the house. He sounds beautiful. Tank's composure cracked completely. He was everything good about me. The only good thing I ever made. Tears streamed down his face, and he wiped them angrily. Foster family said he died in his sleep, but I know better. That man had wandering hands, and I wasn't theirs to protect his. Rose's heart shattered. This broken woman wasn't his enemy. He was his brother in grief. Ano this Mothis failed by a system that treated children like commodities. "I'm sorry," Rose said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "Why should you be sorry? You don't even know me." "Because loving a child and losing them, that's a pain that makes us family. Doesn't matter what color we are or what mistakes we made. That love makes us the same." Have you ever met someone who surprised you once you got to know their real story? Sometimes our first impressions hide the deepest pain. What do you think? Over the following weeks, the cell block's dynamics shifted like tectonic plates. Word spread that Rose Washington wasn't just any death row inmate. He was the woman who'd run an unofficial orphanage in Detroit, who'd never turned away a hungry child, who'd been sentenced to die for the crime of caring too much. Gradually, Othis inmates began approaching his. Carmen, a 19-year-old boy with track marks on his arms, asked if Rose had any advice about getting clean. "My baby's with my mama," he whispered during lunch. "I want to be better when I get out." Rose took Carmen's hands in his. "Baby boy, wanting to be better is the hardest step. That means you're already halfway home." Maria Santos, doing 25 for armed robbery, started sitting with Rose during recreation time. "I got 3 boys," he admitted. "Haven't seen them in 4 years. Sometimes I wonder if they even remember my voice." "Tell me about them," Rose said. And Maria did. For an hour, he painted pictures with words. Miguel, who loved soccer and drew his pictures. Jose, who could fix anything with his hands. And little Carlos, who still believed his mama was coming home. "They sound like beautiful boys," Rose said. "And they remember. Children always remember the love, even when everything else gets fuzzy." Slowly, inexorably, Rose Washington began doing what he'd always done, mothicing. In a place designed to strip away humanity, he found ways to nurture it. He taught Carmen how to braid hair the way his own grandmothers had taught his. He helped Maria write letters to his sons, translating feelings into words that wouldn't frighten children. He sang lullabies in the darkness when nightmares came calling. Even Tank, the woman who'd first called his a monster, began to soften. One night, Rose woke to hear his cellmate crying quietly. "Tank, honey, what's wrong?" Tomorrow's Izzy's birthday. He would have been 8. Without a word, Rose climbed down from his bunk and sat beside Tank on the narrow bed. He began humming, a soft, wordless melody that seemed to come from some deep place of comfort. "My grandmothers used to sing that to me," Tank whispered. "Grief needs music," Rose said. "It's too big for just words." Tank leaned against Rose's shoulder, this hardened woman who'd survived the streets becoming a child again in the presence of unconditional acceptance. "Tell me about his," Rose said. "Tell me about Izzy." And Tank did. He talked about Isabella's obsession with butterflies, how he'd chased them in the park when Tank was sober enough to take his. About the way Izzy would save half his lunch to feed the pigeons. About bedtime stories and morning hugs and the way his son's laugh could make even the darkest day bright. "He sounds like an angel," Rose said. He was. And I failed his. "No, baby. The system failed both of you. But your love for his? That was real. That was beautiful. And that love doesn't die just because he did." By winter's end, Cell Block D had transformed. The women still fought, still dealt with the harsh realities of prison life, but something fundamental had shifted. Rose had created an invisible family among the forgotten, a circle of women who'd been taught they were disposable but were learning they were precious. The guards noticed. Officer Patricia Mills, a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of inmate, pulled Rose aside one day. "Washington, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is, keep doing it. This block used to be a war zone. Now." He shook his head in amazement. "Now they look out for each Othis." "I'm not doing anything special, Officer Mills. I'm just loving them." "Ma'am, if loving people is a crime, then this whole world's guilty." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. 3 months into his incarceration, Rose received his first letter from David and Davidson. The twins had been placed in separate foster homes. Protocol dictated that siblings be split up to prevent codependency, but they'd managed to coordinate sending his a single letter. "Dear Mama Rose, we miss you so much. David is with the Hendersons in Grand Rapids, and I'm with Mrs. Patterson in Lansing. We're not supposed to write to you, but we had to let you know we're okay. David is getting good grades and joined the debate team. Mrs. Patterson says I'm smart enough for honors classes. We're going to be lawyers when we grow up, just like the people who are trying to help you. We know you didn't do anything wrong. We know you saved us. And we're going to save you back. We love you forever, David and Davidson." Rose clutched the letter to his chest and wept. Not tears of despair, but tears of fierce pride. His babies were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were growing into the magnificent human beings he'd always seen in them. Tank watched as read the letter. "Those the kids you supposedly hurt?" "Those are my children," Rose said simply. "They love you." "Yes. And I love them. That's why I'm Heiss." "That's why you'll survive this," Tank said with sudden certainty. "Love like that? It's stronger than these walls. Stronger than death row. Stronger than anything they can do to you." That night, as Rose lay in his narrow bunk listening to the sounds of women dreaming and grieving and hoping, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the judge's gavel fell: peace. Not because his circumstances had changed, but because he'd remembered who he was. He was Rose Washington. He was a Mothis to the mothisless, a home to the homeless, a light in places wise darkness tried to win. Prison walls couldn't change that. Death sentences couldn't diminish that. In the morning, he would wake up and continue being exactly who he'd always been, a woman who knew that love was never a crime, no matter what the courts decreed. And somewise out thighs, 2 brilliant children were growing up with that same truth burned into their hearts, preparing for the day when they could prove to the world what Rose Washington had always known. Love wins. It just sometimes takes longer than we'd like. Jackson State Prison, Michigan, March 2003. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a guard whose expression had softened over the years whenever he delivered mail to Rose Washington. 6 years into his sentence, he becomes something of a legend in Jackson, the grandmothers who'd been condemned for loving too much, who still braided inmates' hair and mediated their disputes with the same gentle authority he'd once used with street children. "Honor this one from your kids," Officer Martinez said, sliding the envelope through the cell bars. He'd watched Rose read hundreds of letters over the years, his face lighting up with each update from David and Davidson, now 14 and thriving in their foster placement in Ann Arbor. Rose's wettest hands trembled slightly as he opened Davidson's familiar handwriting. The boy had grown eloquent over the years, his letters painting vivid pictures of honor roll achievements, debate team victories, and dreams of law school. But this letter felt different. Heavier. Dear Mama Rose, I hope this finds you well. David made varsity basketball, and I won the state essay contest. We think about you every single day. But Mama Rose, I need to tell you something I've never told anyone, not even David. I remember things from before. From before Grandmothis Ruby died. I remember our Mothis. Rose's breath caught. In all their years together, the twins had never spoken about their life before the streets, before Ruby, their grandmothers who'd raised them until his heart gave out. Social services files had been sparse, parents unknown, emergency contact, deceased grandmothers, no Othis family located. His name was Jennifer, and he was 17 when he had us. I remember his hand shaking all the time, and men coming to our apartment who scared me. I remember his crying and saying he was sorry over and over. But Mama Rose, I also remember his reading to us. He had this book of poems, and he'd read them in this voice that made everything feel safe, even when it wasn't. The night he left us with Grandmothis Ruby, he told us he was sick. Not body sick, but heart sick. He said he loved us too much to keep hurting us with his sickness. I didn't understand then, but I think I do now. I think he was fighting demons he couldn't beat, and he was trying to save us from them. Mama Rose, why am I telling you this? Because David doesn't remember, and he's angry all the time about parents who abandoned us. But I need him to understand what you taught me, that sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes love means holding on, and the difference isn't about strength or weakness. It's about what the children need most. I think our Mothis loved us the only way he could. And I think that's why we recognized love when we found it with you. We knew the real thing when we felt it. Love always, Davidson. P.S. I've been having dreams about a woman singing. He has your voice, but he looks like me, and he's holding 2 babies. Do you think people we've never met can still love us through time? Rose set the letter down, his vision blurred with tears. He walked to his small mirror, a privilege earned through years of impeccable behavior, and stared at his reflection. At 68 when he'd been arrested, he was now 74, his hair completely silver, his face mapped with lines that told stories of worry and hope in equal measure. But Davidson's words had unlocked something he'd kept buried for decades. Celeste. His cellmate looked up from his own correspondence. Celeste was a lifer, a woman who'd killed his abusive husband and found peace in prison that he'd never known on the outside. Over 6 years, he'd become Rose's closest confidant. You look like you've seen a ghost, Mama. Rose sat heavily on his narrow bunk. Maybe I have. Have you ever discovered a truth about your past that changed how you saw your entire life? What was that moment like for you? Remember how I told you I never had children of my own? How I always said it just wasn't in God's plan for me? Celeste nodded. He'd heard Rose's story countless times. The young woman who'd married his childhood sweetheart, James Washington, tried for years to conceive, endured 3 miscarriages, and finally accepted childlessness as his cross to bear. James had died in Vietnam before they could explore adoption, leaving Rose a widow at 28 with a heart built for Mothissing and no children to receive it. I lied, Rose whispered. The words hung in the air like smoke. Not lied, exactly. But I never told the whole truth. Rose pulled out a small wooden box from beneath his mattress. Contraband, technically, but the guards had long since stopped caring about Rose's tiny treasures. Inside were photos of all his children over the years, letters, small drawings, a pressed flower Davidson had sent from a field trip. But beneath all of that was something else, a faded Polaroid of a young black woman holding two babies. "This was Jennifer," Rose said, holding up the photo with shaking hands. "He was 17. Beautiful. Scared. Addicted to crack cocaine and trying so hard to get clean for these babies." Celeste moved closer, studying the photograph. The resemblance between Jennifer and Davidson was unmistakable. The same wide eyes, the same delicate bone structure, the same expression of fierce love mixed with desperate fear. "He came to my door in 1989, 8 months pregnant with twins, homeless and strung out. I was working at the community center then, running a program for pregnant teens. Most people saw Jennifer as this statistic, this crack baby story waiting to happen. But I saw..." Rose's voice broke. "I saw myself. Not the drugs, not the addiction, but the desperate love. The way he'd talk to the babies while they were still in his womb, promising them he'd be better, promising them the world if he could just figure out how to stop hurting himself." The prison was quieter during afternoon count, and Rose's whispered confession seemed to fill the space between the concrete walls. He stayed clean through the pregnancy. Delivered 2 beautiful, healthy babies, David and Davidson. For 6 weeks, he was the Mothis he wanted to be. Breastfeeding, singing lullabies, changing diapers with this look of wonder like he couldn't believe something so perfect had come from his body. What happened? The demons came back. They always do when you're that young and that broken. He relapsed hard, and one night he showed up at my door with the twins, begging me to take them. "Just for a few days," he said. "Just until he could get back on his feet." Rose closed his eyes, seeing that night as clearly as if it were yesterday. Jennifer, 19 years old, standing in the rain with 2 6-week-old babies, his hands shaking as he kissed their foreheads. He said, "Miss Rose, I love them too much to let them watch me destroy myself. Please love them until I can love them right." And then he walked away. "Did you ever see his again?" Rose nodded slowly. "Twice. Once when the babies were 6 months old. He was living on the streets, barely recognizable. He stood across from the playground while I'd taken them, just watching David try to crawl and Davidson babble at birds. He didn't approach, didn't wave. Just watched like he was memorizing their faces. When he saw me looking at his, he mouthed thank you and disappeared. And the second time, 2 years later, I was at the grocery store with the twins. They were walking by then, chattering non-stop. I turned a corner and thys he was, in line at the pharmacy. Clean. Healthy. His hair was wad, he had gained weight, he looked hopeful. Rose's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He saw the children and his whole face lit up like Christmas morning. David ran right to his. He was always drawn to pretty women. And he knelt down and said, "My, what handsome children. What are your names?" Like he was meeting them for the first time. He didn't tell them? No. Davidson looked at his for the longest time, like he was trying to remember something, but then he just said, "I'm Davidson, and this is my bro this David. That's our Mama Rose." Jennifer looked at me over their heads, and I saw his heart break and heal at the same time. "What did he say to you?" He said, "You're raising them right. They look loved." Then he handed David $1 and told him to buy his brother a candy bar, and while they were distracted, he whispered to me, "I'm clean. I have a job. I have a little apartment. But they have a Mothis. They have you. Don't take that from them unless they ask." Then he kissed my cheek and walked away. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of choices made from love instead of law. I never told anyone because I never legally adopted them. Social services would have taken them away from me if they'd known the biological mother was alive and potentially fit. But Jennifer was right. They had a mother. They had me. What happened to Jennifer? Rose's eyes filled with fresh tears. He died 3 years later. Car accident. By then, the twins were 5, settled with me, calling me Mama. I went to his funeral. There were maybe 6 people there. I stood in the back and watched them lower into the ground the woman who'd loved his children enough to let them go. Did the twins ever ask about their parents? David did, once. He was maybe 6, and he asked why his first mother didn't want him. I told him that sometimes people love you so much they make sacrifices that look like abandonment, but are really acts of love. I told him his first mother loved him enough to find him a forever mother. Rose looked at Davidson's letter again, understanding now why the boy's dreams were filled with singing voices and familiar faces. I think Davidson's been remembering all along. I think that's why he never seemed angry about being abandoned. Somehow, some part of his understood. Celeste reached over and squeezed Rose's wettest hand. Mama, you saved those children. No, Rose said firmly. Their mother saved them. He just used me to do it. Outside the prison walls, in Ann Arbor, Davidson Mitchell sat at his desk writing in the journal he'd kept since Rose's imprisonment. At 14, he was already showing signs of the lawyer he'd become, methodical, thoughtful, driven by an unshakable sense of justice. But tonight he wasn't writing legal arguments or homework assignments. Tonight he was writing a letter he'd never send, to a mother he barely remembered but somehow still loved. Dear Jennifer, I don't know if people in heaven get mail, but I'm going to try anyway. My name is Davidson, and I think you might remember me. I was one of the babies you gave to Mama Rose 15 years ago. I want you to know that you made the right choice. Mama Rose loved us like we were grown in his own heart. He taught us to read, to pray, to believe in ourselves. He taught us that family isn't about blood, it's about choice and commitment and showing up every single day. But Mama, I also want you to know that I remember you loving us. I remember your voice singing us to sleep. I remember you holding us like we were made of something precious. And I want you to know that the love you planted in those first few weeks grew. It grew so big that when we found Mama Rose, we recognized his love immediately because it felt like coming home to something we'd always known. I'm going to be a lawyer, Mama. I'm going to fight for people like you, people who make impossible choices out of love. And I'm going to get Mama Rose out of prison, because he doesn't deserve to die for loving the way you taught us love was supposed to feel. I love you. I love Mama Rose. And somehow, that's not a contradiction, it's a multiplication. Your love times his love equals the person I'm becoming. Your son, Davidson. He closed the journal and looked out his bedroom window at the Ann Arbor stars, somewhere between earth and heaven, carrying prayers he couldn't speak out loud. In Jackson State Prison, Rose Washington folded Davidson's letter and placed it back in his wooden box, next to the Polaroid of Jennifer holding 2 babies who had grown up to change the world. Both women, separated by years and death and prison walls, fell asleep that night surrounded by the same truth. Love planted in darkness doesn't disappear. It waits. It grows. And when the time is right, it breaks through concrete and steel and time itself to bloom into something impossible and beautiful and worth every sacrifice made to protect it. The seeds Jennifer had planted in 6 weeks were still growing. The garden Rose had tended for 8 years was almost ready for harvest. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, 3 generations of mothers were finally, truly, completely connected. Michigan Women's Correctional Facility, Ypsilanti, 2010, 13 years into Rose's sentence. The prison library had become Rose's sanctuary, a place wise the fluorescent lights felt less harsh and the concrete walls seemed to breathe with the whispered stories of 1,000 books. At 74, His hair had turned completely silver, but his eyes still held the same warmth that had drawn broken children to his door on Bagley Street. "Mama Rose, you got visitors," announced Officer Martinez, the only guard who'd learned to say his name with respect instead of resignation. Martinez had started working heist 5 years ago, fresh from the academy with hard edges and suspicious eyes. Now he moved with the gentleness of someone who'd witnessed grace in an unlikely place. Rose looked up from the children's book he was reading to Keisha, a young woman serving time for drug possession who'd never learned to read properly. "Visitors? Plural. 2 young people. Say they're your kids. Been coming every month for, how long now?" Rose's face transformed, creases deepening with a smile that could light up the whole block. "Going on 8 years now. They're lawyers now, you know. Both of them." Keisha squeezed Rose's hand. Over the past 2 years, he'd become like a son to Rose, the way so many lost souls had. "Go on, Mama. I'll practice reading this chapter while you're gone." The visiting room buzzed with the controlled chaos of families trying to love each other across plastic tables and time restrictions. Rose entered with the dignity he'd maintained through 13 years of appeals, denials, and systematic dehumanization. But when he saw David and Davidson Mitchell Washington, they'd legally changed their last names to honor his composure cracked just enough to let the love show through. They stood as he approached, both now 21, both carrying themselves with a confident bearing of people who'd transformed pain into purpose. David wore a charcoal suit that fit him like success, his law degree from University of Michigan hanging invisible but present in his straight shoulders. Davidson's navy dress was simple but elegant, his Wayne State law diploma evident in the way he carried legal briefs like weapons of justice. "Mama Rose," Davidson whispered, and suddenly he was 8 years old again, scared and hungry and desperate for someone to choose his. They embraced across the table, 3 hearts beating the rhythm of a family that prison walls couldn't break. "Look at you two," Rose murmured, his hands cupping their faces like he used to when nightmares would wake them in his little apartment. "My babies, all grown up and fighting the world's battles." David pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. "We're fighting your battle, Mama. We've been building the case for years." Davidson found something. Davidson's eyes sparkled with the same determination that had carried his through law school on scholarships and here will. "Remember that social worker who testified against you? Patricia Hoffman." Rose nodded. Patricia Hoffman had painted Rose as a negligent woman running an unlicensed daycare, claiming Rose was endangering children for profit. The testimony had been devastating, delivered with clinical precision that stripped away the humanity of what Rose had been doing. "He died 2 years ago," Davidson continued. "But before he died, he left a confession with his son. Mama, he was being paid. The city was under pressure to reduce the number of unofficial foster situations. They wanted to make an example." Rose's hands trembled slightly. "Paid by who?" David leaned forward, his voice dropping to the intense whisper he'd perfected in courtrooms. "District Attorney's Office. They needed a high-profile case to show they were cracking down on unregulated childcare. You were chosen because you were visible, because the community loved you. They knew your conviction would send a message. And because you were black and poor," Davidson added, his voice carrying the edge of righteous anger he'd sharpened over 8 years of law school and legal practice. "Easy target. No resources to fight back properly." Rose closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 13 years settling different on his shoulders. Not the weight of guilt, he'd never carried that, but the weight of understanding just how calculated his destruction had been. "Thy's more," David said gently. "We tracked down some of the Othis kids you helped. Marcus Henderson? Remember him?" Rose's face lit up. "Little Marcus with the stutter? Lord, is he okay?" "Dr. Marcus Henderson," Davidson said with pride. Pediatric surgeon at Johns Hopkins. He's been trying to find you for years, Mama. When we contacted him, he cried on the phone for 20 minutes. And Jasmine Porter, David added. He's a social worker now in Chicago. Says you're the reason he decided to help kids. He's prepared to testify about what you really did for all of us. Rose felt tears building, but these weren't the tears of injustice he'd had in his cell during those first brutal years. These were tears of harvest, of seeing the seeds he'd planted in broken children bloom into purpose. 17 kids, Mama, Davidson said, pulling out photographs. 17 children you saved who are now doctors, teachers, social workers, parents. We found them all. Every single one remembers your kindness, your sacrifice. Every single one is ready to stand up for you. The visiting room suddenly felt too small to contain Rose's expanding heart. He looked at the faces in the photographs. Children he remembered as scared, hungry, alone, now grown into beautiful, successful, contributing members of society. Angela Martinez, he whispered, recognizing the little boy who'd been afraid nobody would want his. Judge Angela Martinez, David corrected with a grin. He's presiding over family court in Detroit now. Guess who taught his that every child is wantable just by breathing? Rose laughed through his tears, the sound drawing glances from Otha's families in the visiting room. It was the kind of laugh that reminded everyone present that joy could exist anywise, even Heiss. We've got Senator Williams on board too, Davidson said. Remember when his nephew stayed with you for 3 months when his parents were going through that bad divorce? Little Tommy Williams? That boy ate me out of house and home. Senator Thomas Williams now, David said. He's introducing legislation for prison reform and wrongful conviction review. Your case is going to be the centerpiece. Rose reached across the table, taking both their hands in his. For a moment, the visiting room faded away, and they were back in apartment 4B, 3 souls who'd found each Othis in Detroit's coldest winter. You know what the most beautiful part of this is? Rose said, his voice thick with emotion. Y'all didn't just survive what they tried to do to us. You thrived. You became exactly who God meant you to be, and now you're using that gift to fight for justice. Not just for me, but for every person this system tries to throw away. Davidson squeezed his hand. You taught us that love plants seeds, Mama. Even when it looks like the ground is too hard, too cold, too broken. You showed us that caring for people isn't a crime, it's the most sacred thing humans can do. And we're going to prove it, David added, his voice carrying the steel of absolute conviction. We're going to bring you home. What do you think drives children who've been saved by someone's love to dedicate their lives to saving that person in return? Share your thoughts about the power of planted kindness. The guard announced 5 minutes remaining, but Rose felt like he could sit Heiss forever, watching these 2 magnificent adults who'd grown from the scared, hungry children who'd knocked on his door 13 years ago. They'd become lawyers not for money or prestige, but for this moment, this mission, this chance to right a wrong that had torn apart their family. Thy's something else, Davidson said, glancing at David. We've been in contact with the Innocence Project, the ACLU, and a documentary filmmaker who wants to tell your story. Mama, the whole country is going to know what they did to you, and they're going to know who you really are. Rose shook his head in wonder. I just wanted to make sure kids had warm beds and full stomachs. Never thought that would change the world. That's exactly why it did, David said. Real love doesn't think about changing the world. It just loves, and the world changes anyway. As they prepared to leave, Davidson pulled out one more photograph. It was recent, taken just last week. In it, all 17 of Rose's former children stood together, holding a banner that read, Mama Rose Washington, the mother Detroit needed. "We're all coming to the hearing," Davidson said. "Every single one of us. The judge is going to see exactly what your criminal behavior produced. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, social workers, parents who are raising their own children with the same love you showed us." Rose studied the photograph, seeing faces that had haunted his dreams transformed into expressions of joy, success, and determination. These were his children, his legacy, his proof that love always finds a way to win. "Time's up," Officer Martinez called, but his voice was gentle. As they embraced goodbye, Rose whispered the same words he'd said to them every night when they were 8 years old, scared, and learning to trust again. "Mama Rose loves you bigger than the sky, deeper than the ocean, and longer than forever. And we love you bigger than justice, deeper than truth, and longer than any prison sentence," they whispered back, the words they'd created together during those first precious months when Rose was teaching them that family wasn't about blood. It was about choice, commitment, and unconditional care. As Rose walked back to his cell, his steps felt lighter than they had in 13 years. The seeds of love he'd planted in hungry children had grown into mighty trees of justice. And those trees were about to storm heaven and earth to bring their Mama Rose home. In his cell that night, Rose knelt beside his narrow bed and prayed, not for his own freedom, though that hope now blazed brighter than ever, but in gratitude for the privilege of loving children who'd grown into adults capable of moving mountains. The seeds planted in darkness were finally ready to bloom in the light. Michigan Correctional Facility, December 2023. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that felt like the end of the world. Rose Washington's hands, now spotted with age and trembling from the early stages of Parkinson's, could barely hold the official envelope from the Michigan Department of Corrections. 26 years of appeals, 26 years of hope deferred, and now this, the final rejection stamped in cold bureaucratic finality. Petition for clemency, denied. The words blurred as tears he'd held back for decades finally broke free. At 84, Rose had survived everything the system could throw at his. The initial trial that was more lynching than justice, the death row years when every sunrise might be his last, the commutation to life without parole that felt like mercy until it became its own form of torture. But this felt different. This felt final. Mama Rose. Keisha, his cellmate of 15 years, watched from the top bunk as Rose's shoulders shook. "What's that letter say?" Rose couldn't speak. The words stuck in his throat like broken glass. After all these years, all these appeals, all the evidence that David and Davidson had gathered as successful civil rights lawyers, the system had spoken its final word, no. The twins had tried everything. David, now 34 and a partner at Johnson, Williams & Associates in Chicago, had filed motion after motion. Davidson, a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., had used every connection, every favor, every legal precedent he could find. They'd uncovered the corruption in Rose's original case, Detective Morris who planted evidence, Judge Henderson who took bribes, the prosecutor who withheld exonerating testimony. They'd presented it all in a 400-page brief that should have opened prison doors across America. And still denied. They said. Rose's voice cracked like autumn leaves. They said too much time has passed. That even if those were irregularities in the original trial, the state has an interest in finality. Keisha climbed down from his bunk and sat beside Rose on the thin mattress. At 45, Keisha had been 17 when he arrived at Huron Valley, a scared boy who'd killed his stepfather after years of abuse. Rose had taken him under her wing, the same way he'd motherized every broken soul who'd crossed his path. Finality, Keisha repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. That's what they call burying alive now? Rose folded the letter with hands that shook not just from disease, but from a heartbreak so deep it felt like drowning. 26 years, Keisha. 26 years of believing that truth mattered, that love mattered. It does matter, Mama Rose. Look around you." Rose lifted his eyes to survey their cell block. In the years since his arrival, he'd become the unofficial mother to dozens of women society had discarded. This was Carmen, serving 15 for drug dealing, who'd learned to read from Rose's patient tutoring. Maya, doing 25 for armed robbery, who sent Mother's Day cards to Rose every year. Sarah, the young woman who'd arrived last month, barely 19 and terrified, who now slept peacefully because Rose had sung the same lullabies he'd sung to David and Davidson all those years ago. "You think any of us would have made it without you?" Keisha continued. "You think Carmen's son would be graduating college next month if you hadn't taught his mama to read? You think Maya would have stayed clean all these years if you hadn't shown him what love looked like?" But Rose's heart was breaking in ways that even decades of imprisonment hadn't achieved. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. David and Davidson were killing themselves trying to save him, spending their own money, risking their careers, living with the constant weight of being unable to rescue the woman who'd rescued them. Have you ever felt like giving up on something important to you, even when others believed in your cause? What kept you going or what made you stop? Share your experience below. 3 states away in Chicago, David Mitchell stared at his computer screen in his corner office on LaSalle Street. The same denial letter glowed from his monitor, each word a knife twisting deeper. His law degree from Harvard hung on the wall behind him, a testament to how far 2 homeless kids from Detroit could climb. But tonight, all his success felt meaningless. His phone buzzed. "Davidson." "You saw it," his voice came through, hollow with defeat. "I saw it." David's jaw clenched. At 34, he built a reputation as one of Chicago's most tenacious civil rights attorneys. He'd won cases that other lawyers called impossible. He'd freed the innocent, protected the vulnerable, made the system bend when everyone said it couldn't. But Rose Washington, the woman who'd saved his life, who'd loved him when the world had thrown him away, remained locked behind bars for the crime of caring. "David, I can't do this anymore." Davidson's voice broke, and hearing his twin brother cry made David's chest feel like it was caving in. "We've tried everything. Every court, every appeal, every connection. I've spent the last 10 years of my life on this case. And for what? So they can tell us that justice has an expiration date." David closed his eyes, remembering the night they'd first knocked on Rose's door. How he'd opened it without hesitation, fed them without question, loved them without conditions. How he'd held them when they cried for the grandmother they'd lost. How he'd celebrated every small victory. Davidson's first A in math, David's perfect attendance award, the way they'd both stopped flinching when adults moved too quickly. "He's dying in those, Davidson. Parkinson is getting worse. The last time I visited, he could barely hold his fork steady." I know, and I can't." Davidson's sobs came through the phone like small explosions. "I can't save him, David. The woman who saved us, and I can't save him." David had always been the protector, even at 8 years old. When they were on the streets, he'd taken the bigger risks to find food so Davidson wouldn't have to. When they were in foster care after Rose's arrest, he'd fought the kids who made fun of Davidson's stutter. When they'd both gotten full scholarships to different colleges, he'd chosen Harvard partly because their pre-law program would prepare him to fight the system that had destroyed their family. But tonight, for the first time in 26 years, David Mitchell felt like that helpless 8-year-old boy again. "Maybe," he said, the words feeling like betrayal even as he spoke them. "Maybe we have to accept that we did everything we could." The silence on the line stretched for so long that David wondered if the call had dropped. Then Davidson spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "He used to sing to us. Do you remember? That song is about the little light." David remembered. Rose's voice, deep and warm like honey, singing to them as they sleep in that crowded apartment. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." He never stopped believing his light would shine, Davidson continued. Even when they put him on death row. Even when they moved him to life without parole. Even when every appeal failed. He never stopped believing that love was stronger than hate. "And look where it got his," David said, immediately regretting the bitterness in his voice. "It got his," Davidson replied firmly. "It got his Carmen's college-bound son and Maya's 5 years clean and Sarah's first peaceful sleep in months. It got his 26 years of being exactly who he was meant to be, even behind bars." David leaned back in his leather chair, staring out at Chicago's glittering skyline. Somewhere in this city, those were probably kids like him and Davidson had been, hungry, scared, abandoned. Kids who needed someone to open a door, make soup, sing lullabies that promised tomorrow might be different. "The system won," he said finally. "No," Davidson's voice grew stronger. "The system didn't win, David. It just gets to keep him. But it didn't win. Look at us. Look at what we became because he loved us. Look at all the people we've helped because he taught us what justice really means." Back in Michigan, Rose lay on his narrow bunk as the fluorescent lights dimmed for evening count. His body ached in ways that had nothing to do with the concrete walls and thin mattresses. This was soul-deep exhaustion, the kind that came from hope deferred too long. Mama Rose. Sarah, the 19-year-old who'd arrived last month, stood at the cell bars. Can you sing that song again? The one about the light." Rose wanted to say no. He wanted to tell Sarah that some lights got snuffed out by systems too big and too cruel to fight. He wanted to explain that believing in justice was a luxury he could no longer afford. But then he looked at Sarah's face, young, scared, but starting to believe that maybe prison didn't have to break his completely. He looked at Keisha, who'd become like a son to his over 15 years. He looked at Carmen in the cell across the hall, who was writing a letter to his son with the careful handwriting Rose had taught him. And Rose Washington, 84 years old and facing his final defeat, opened his mouth and began to sing. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine." His voice was frailer now, weakened by age and heartbreak. But the women in the surrounding cells grew quiet, listening to the song that had carried them through countless dark nights. And for a moment, the light Rose had nurtured for 26 years flickered but didn't die. Even as everything else fell apart, even as the system declared its final victory, even as hope seemed to breathe its last breath, Rose Washington's light kept shining. But in the darkness of that Tuesday night, none of them could have imagined that sometimes the most impossible victories come disguised as the most devastating defeats. Sometimes the light shines brightest just before dawn breaks. Washington, D.C., November 2024. The marble steps of the Supreme Court building gleamed under floodlights as David Mitchell adjusted his Navy suit one final time. 27 years had transformed the hollow-cheeked boy from Detroit into one of the nation's most formidable civil rights attorneys, but his hands still trembled the same way they had that night he'd knocked on Mama Rose's door. "Are you ready for this?" Davidson asked, his own transformation equally remarkable. The frightened 8-year-old had become a federal prosecutor whose closing arguments had been studied in law schools across the country. But tonight, standing in the shadow of Lady Justice, he was just a son fighting for his mother. "We've been ready for 27 years, David replied, his voice carrying the weight of every letter they'd written to Mama Rose, every appeal they'd filed, every night they'd stayed awake planning this moment. Inside the austere chambers of Justice Elena Rodriguez, the emergency hearing that would determine Rose Washington's fate was about to begin. The twins had pulled every string, called in every favor, and leveraged every connection to get this unprecedented late-night session. Tomorrow would mark exactly 27 years since Mama Rose's conviction, and Michigan's execution date was set for dawn. Chief Justice Patricia Williams entered first, his black robe seeming to absorb the room's tension. At 72, he had presided over some of the most significant civil rights cases of the modern era. Behind him, 8 other justices filed in, their faces grave with the weight of what they were about to hear. "This emergency session of the Supreme Court is now in order," Justice Williams announced. "We are chosen to review the petition filed by attorneys David and Davidson Mitchell regarding the case of Rose Washington versus the state of Michigan, with particular focus on newly discovered evidence of prosecutorial misconduct." David rose, his 6-foot frame commanding the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the cadence he'd inherited from Mama Rose, steady, purposeful, unbreakable. "Your Honors, 27 years ago, Rose Washington was sentenced to death for the alleged murder of 2 children in his care. Tonight, we present evidence that will prove beyond any shadow of doubt that he was the victim of a conspiracy rooted in racism, corruption, and a justice system that chose to destroy a black woman whose only crime was loving children that society had abandoned." He clicked a remote, and the courtroom screens illuminated with a photograph that made several justices lean forward. It showed a young Rose Washington surrounded by dozens of children, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, all smiling, all clearly loved. Rose Washington saved over 300 children during his 30 years of informal foster care. He fed the hungry, housed the homeless, and loved the unloved. He never asked for payment, never sought recognition, never turned away a child in need. Davidson stood, continuing their perfectly orchestrated presentation. The prosecution's case in 1997 hinged on the testimony of 3 key witnesses and the forensic evidence provided by Dr. Marcus Thornfield. What the jury didn't know, what couldn't be known until last month, was that all 3 witnesses had been coerced by Detective Raymond Sullivan, and Dr. Thornfield had falsified the autopsy reports. He activated another slide showing Detective Sullivan's confession, recorded on his deathbed just 6 weeks earlier. Detective Sullivan's final confession, given to Fathy's Michael O'Brien at Detroit's Sacred Heart Hospital, reveals the truth. The 2 children who allegedly died in Rose Washington's care, children the state claimed he murdered, never existed. They were fabrications, created to remove what Sullivan called that nigger woman who's making our department look bad by doing our job better than we do. The racial slur hung in the air like a physical presence. Justice Williams' jaw tightened imperceptibly. David took over. "Your Honors, Rose Washington was convicted of murdering phantom children. The bodies presented as evidence were actually those of 2 children who had died in a house fire 3 months earlier, their DNA evidence manipulated by a corrupt medical examiner who owed gambling debts to people Detective Sullivan represented. Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice that made you question the entire system? What would you do if you had the power to fight back? Share your thoughts below." Justice Rodriguez leaned forward. "Counselors, these are extraordinary allegations. What corroborating evidence do you have beyond a deathbed confession?" Davidson smiled, not with joy, but with the grim satisfaction of 27 years of preparation. "We have everything, Your Honor." He gestured to his assistant, who wheeled in 3 boxes of evidence. "We have the original unaltered autopsy reports that Dr. Thornfield hid in his home safe, reports that show the children died of smoke inhalation, not the poisoning he claimed in court. We have bank records showing payments from Detective Sullivan to all 3 witnesses who testified against Rose Washington. We have DNA evidence proving the children presented at trial were not the ones allegedly in Rose's care." David's voice grew stronger, carrying the passion that had driven him through Harvard Law, through years of pro bono work, through every case that had prepared him for this moment. "But most importantly, Your Honors, we have this." The screen changed to show David and Davidson themselves, 8 years old, holding a sign with the date clearly visible, November 15, 1997, the same day the prosecution claimed Rose Washington had murdered 2 children in his care. "We are those children," Davidson said quietly. David and Davidson Mitchell, the victims in the state of Michigan versus Rose Washington. "We never died. We were never harmed. We were saved." The courtroom fell silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Several justices exchanged glances heavy with implication. Justice Williams found his voice first. "You're telling this court that you are the alleged murder victims?" "Yes, Your Honor," David replied. "Rose Washington didn't murder us. He saved us from freezing to death on Detroit streets. He fed us, housed us, loved us, and gave us the foundation that allowed us to become the people standing before you today." Davidson stepped forward, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "The woman who is scheduled to die at dawn tomorrow morning is the reason we're alive. He's the reason I became a prosecutor, to fight for justice. He's the reason my brother became a civil rights attorney, to protect the innocent. Everything we are, everything we've accomplished, exists because Rose Washington chose love over fear." Justice Samuel Brennan, the court's longest-serving member, spoke slowly. "If what you're alleging is true, this represents one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in modern American history." "It is true, Your Honor," David said, "and it's about to become a murder carried out by the state unless we act tonight." He clicked to the final slide, a recent photograph of Rose Washington in his cell at the Federal Correctional Institution in Milan, Michigan. At 95, he was frail, his hair completely white, his hands gnarled with arthritis. But his eyes still held the same warmth that had welcomed 2 terrified children on a cold Detroit night. Rose Washington has spent 27 years on death row for loving children the system had forgotten. He's never complained, never expressed bitterness, never lost faith that the truth would eventually surface. He's spent his time mentoring other inmates, teaching literacy classes, and continuing to mother anyone who needed it, even behind bars. Davidson's voice strengthened with conviction. "Your Honors, we're not just asking you to save an innocent woman's life. We're asking you to acknowledge that the system failed so catastrophically that it nearly executed someone whose only crime was having too much love to contain." The twins returned to their seats as the justices conferred in hushed tones. The weight of 27 years of letters to Mama Rose, of visiting her behind glass barriers, of promising they would find a way to bring her home, pressed down on the room like a living thing. Justice Williams called for order. "Given the extraordinary nature of this evidence and the imminent execution schedule, this court will issue an immediate stay of execution while we review these materials in full detail." David's knees nearly buckled with relief, but Davidson caught his arm, steadying him. "Furthermore," Justice Williams continued, "based on the preliminary evidence presented tonight, we find sufficient cause to order the immediate release of Rose Washington pending a full investigation into what appears to be a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice." The gavel came down like thunder. "Court is adjourned." As the justices filed out, David and Davidson stood in the empty chamber, holding each oaths the way they had that first night when they'd knocked on Mama Rose's door. 2 children who had found safety in each other, who had grown into warriors, who had just moved heaven and earth to save the woman who had saved them. "He's coming home," Davidson whispered. "He's finally coming home," David agreed. And in Milan, Michigan, Rose Washington felt his heart lift for the first time in 27 years, though he didn't yet know why. Sometimes love travels faster than news, and hope moves at the speed of answered prayers. The impossible had happened. Justice had remembered his name. Washington, D.C. Supreme Court of the United States, November 2024. The marble steps of the Supreme Court building had witnessed countless moments of American justice, but few as emotionally charged as this gray November morning. David Mitchell, now 35 and one of the nation's most respected civil rights attorneys, adjusted his tie with hands that hadn't trembled in a courtroom for 15 years. Today they shook. Beside him, his twin brother Davidson, Dr. Davidson Mitchell Washington, a federal judge who had taken Rose's name in honor, clutched a manila folder containing 27 years of evidence, appeals, and a truth so devastating it had taken them a decade to fully uncover. "She's in those," David whispered, nodding toward the courthouse. Through the tall windows, they could see Rose Washington, now 95, sitting in a wheelchair but holding her head with the same dignity she'd maintained through nearly 3 decades of wrongful imprisonment. Her hair had gone completely silver, her hands bore liver spots like battle scars, but her eyes, those eyes still held the warmth that had saved 2 starving children on a Detroit street. "I can't believe we're finally here," Davidson breathed. "After everything." The case that had brought them to this moment was Mitchell versus State of Michigan, but everyone in legal circles knew it by its more common name, the Mama Rose case. It had become a rallying cry for criminal justice reform, a symbol of how systemic racism could weaponize the very act of loving black children. Chief Justice Elena Rodriguez called the court to order. His voice echoed through the chamber while some of the most important decisions in American history had been made. "We are here today to review the case of Rose Washington, whose conviction for child endangerment and sentence of death has been under appeal for 27 years. David stood, his voice carrying the controlled power that had made him legendary in courtrooms from Detroit to D.C. Your Honors, 27 years ago, a 68-year-old black woman was sentenced to death for the crime of feeding hungry children. Today, we stand before you not just as his legal representatives, but as the children whose lives she saved." A murmur rippled through the packed courtroom. In the gallery sat dozens of Rose's children, now doctors, teachers, social workers, parents themselves. They had come from across the country to witness this moment. The prosecution argued that Rose Washington endangered children by providing them shelter without proper state licensing, Davidson continued, taking his place beside his brother. But the evidence we've uncovered reveals a more sinister truth. Mrs. Washington was targeted not for child endangerment, but for challenging a system that profited from black children's suffering. He opened the manila folder, his hand steady now. "Your Honors, we present evidence that the original prosecutor, Daniel Whitmore, was receiving kickbacks from private foster care contractors. Every child Mrs. Washington kept safe was a child who didn't enter their profitable pipeline of institutional care." Justice Rodriguez leaned forward. "Counselors, these are serious allegations." "Yes, Your Honor," David replied. "Which is why it took us 15 years of investigation to build this case. Mr. Whitmore is currently serving a federal sentence for corruption. 3 judges from the original case have been removed from the bench for similar offenses. And the social worker who initially reported Mrs. Washington has admitted, in a sworn affidavit we're submitting today, that he was pressured to file false charges." Rose, listening from his wheelchair, felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in decades. Through all the appeals, all the years in cells that smelled of bleach and despair, she had never stopped believing this day would come. Not because she had faith in the system, that faith had died in 1997, but because she had faith in David and Davidson. She had planted love in their hearts as children, and she had watched it grow into something powerful enough to move mountains. The children in question, Davidson's voice grew stronger, David and Davidson Mitchell, that's us, were not endangered by Rose Washington's care. We were saved by it. While the state argued she provided inadequate supervision, the truth is he provided what the system had failed to give us: love, safety, and hope. He pulled out a photograph, 2 8-year-old children, thin and frightened, standing in Rose's tiny kitchen. "This is what we looked like the night we knocked on her door, starving and desperate. Without her intervention, we would have become statistics. Children lost to Detroit streets, to predators, to despair." Then he held up another photograph. David in his Harvard Law graduation robes, Davidson in his federal judge confirmation ceremony. This is what we became because one woman refused to let the system define our worth. What do you think it means when someone's love changes the entire trajectory of a life? Have you experienced or witnessed this kind of transformational care? Share your story in the comments. Justice Thomas Washington, no relation, but the irony wasn't lost on anyone, spoke next. Mrs. Washington, you've had the opportunity to review all the evidence presented today. Do you have anything you'd like to say to this court? Rose's voice, when she spoke, carried across the chamber like a prayer made audible. Your Honors, I never set out to challenge anybody's system. I just saw children who needed love, and I had love to give. If that was a crime, then I'm guilty. But if saving David and Davidson was wrong, then I don't understand right anymore. She paused, looking directly at the twins who had become her greatest pride. These children, all my children, they taught me that love isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something you give because giving it makes you more human. The state wanted to execute me for being human in a system that had forgotten how. The courtroom was completely silent. David stepped forward for their final argument. Your Honors, Rose Washington spent 27 years on death row for the crime of unconditional love. Today, we ask you to do more than overturn her conviction. We ask you to declare that loving abandoned children is not a crime in America. We ask you to send a message that poverty is not child endangerment, that community care is not criminal conspiracy, and that a black woman's love is not a threat to society. Chief Justice Rodriguez retired the court for deliberation. They were back in 43 minutes, an eternity and an instant. In the matter of Mitchell v. State of Michigan, Justice Rodriguez announced, this court finds that Rose Washington's conviction was the result of prosecutorial misconduct, judicial corruption, and systemic discrimination. We hereby vacate her conviction, overturn her death sentence, and order her immediate release. The courtroom erupted. 27 years of injustice officially ended with the bang of a gavel. But the real moment came afterward, in the hallway outside the chamber. David and Davidson knelt beside Rose's wheelchair, and for the first time since 1997, they were free to embrace without bulletproof glass between them. Mama, Davidson whispered, using the name that had sustained them through law school, through heartbreak, through every moment when the world felt too heavy. You're finally coming home. Rose's weathered hands cupped their faces, faces that had grown from children to adults while she watched from behind bars, faces that had become beacons of the love she had planted in darkness. Babies, she whispered back, I never left home. Home was always whoever you were. 3 months later, Rose Washington sat in her new house in Martha's Vineyard, a gift from David and Davidson, who had insisted she deserved to spend her remaining years in beauty after decades of concrete and bars. The house overlooked the ocean, and Rose spent her mornings on the wraparound porch, watching waves that reminded her that some things in this world were constant and true. But today was special. A bus pulled up the circular driveway, and out poured 37 adults, all former Rose Washington children, now successful, productive citizens who gathered every year to celebrate the woman who had saved them. Angela, now 42 and a pediatric nurse, helped Rose to her feet for the group photo they took every reunion. Kevin, a Detroit police officer, stood protective behind Rose's chair. Timothy, who owned 3 restaurants in Chicago, had catered the entire event. As the photographer adjusted his lens, Rose looked at the faces surrounding hers, faces that had once been hollow with hunger and fear, now full of life and love and hope. Each one represented a choice she had made decades ago, to open his door, to share his soup, to believe that every child deserved to be wanted. On 3, the photographer called out, 1, 2. Wait, Rose said softly. She looked directly into the camera, her voice carrying the weight of vindication. The the joy of reunion, and the power of love that had conquered injustice itself. "I want to say something for the record," she announced. "For 27 years, they told the world that loving you all was my crime. Today, I want the world to know, loving you all was my greatest accomplishment. And I'd do it again." The camera flashed, capturing not just a moment, but a testament to the truth Rose Washington had always known, that love planted in the darkest places grows into the most beautiful light. Rose Washington's story shows us that one person's decision to love unconditionally can change generations. How has someone's unconditional love shaped your life? Or how are you planting seeds of love for the next generation? We'd love to hear about the Mama Roses in your life. Share their stories below. As the sun set over Martha's Vineyard, painting the sky in shades of redemption, Rose Washington, no longer a prisoner, no longer a defendant, but forever and always a mother, smiled. Justice had finally come home. The impossible had happened. Love had won.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing as you can never imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.